Hey everyone, I'm Liz and today I'm going to be showing you how I made some of these curvy dolls. And as you can see, this is a very customizable doll. As you can see, I've made 4 different shapes and sizes using the same pattern. And if you would like to purchase the pattern, then it's available in my Ravelry store, and you can find the pattern by following the link that's on the screen right now, or you can check in the description down below. Some things that you're going to need for this tutorial are a crochet hook. I'm going to be using a size E, a pair of scissors to cut off your yarn, a yarn needle to sew in your ends, and I'm going to be using a couple of bobby pins to mark my stitches. You're also going to need yarn. For these 2 dolls, I've used this buff yarn from Red Heart Super Saver. For this darker skinned doll, I used this Cafe Latte also from Red Heart Super Saver. And for this doll, I used a combination of Orchid, which is this one from Red Heart Super Saver, and on the bottom I switched colors to gray so that she could have a pair of pants, and then I used white for her feet so that she could have a pair of shoes. You can use just about any yarn for this project. I'm going to be putting a link in the description with a blog post to a few suggestions for skin tones of yarn. I'm going to start by making a double magic circle. You can use a single magic circle if you want, but I find that the double magic circle is a little more secure. So I'm going to wrap my yarn around my fingers twice and take my hook, and I'm going to pull up a loop in the middle of those 2 loops that I had wrapped around my fingers. And I'm going to chain 1. Now you can just chain 1 if you like, but I'm going to chain 1 more just so that it will be a little easier for me to find my first stitch of the row when I do my next row. So this is going to count as my first stitch, and now I'm going to do 5 more single crochets onto these loops. Okay, I have my 6 stitches in total. I've done my chain 2 and my 5 extra stitches, so now I have 6 stitches in total. So I'm going to close my magic circle. I'm going to pull on the tail just a little bit, and now I have my 2 loops here. One of them is a larger loop now, and the other one is smaller because I pulled on my tail. So I'm going to take that smaller loop, and I'm going to pull it from the side closest to the tail until the other loop closes completely. And now I just have this big loop and my tail, so I'm going to just pull on my tail until this big loop closes. And now I'm going to do my second row. Now in this row, I'm going to increase my stitches, so I'm going to put 2 stitches into each stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and find that first stitch that I made in my magic circle and insert my hook, and I'm going to pull up a loop and single crochet. And I'm going to increase that same stitch, but before I do, I'm going to use a bobby pin to mark that as the first stitch of my row. And now that my stitch is marked, I'm just going to go into the same stitch and single crochet again. Now I'm going to do that in every stitch of the row I'm going to increase. So I'm going to go into the second stitch, single crochet once, single crochet again. Now I'm going to go into the third one and single crochet twice. And I'm going to single crochet twice in every stitch of the row until I get back to my stitch marker. Okay, I've gotten to my stitch marker, so I'm going to remove it and do the first stitch of my next row. And then I'm going to mark that stitch with my stitch marker. And in this row, I'm going to increase every second stitch. So I've done the first stitch of the row already. So here is the second stitch of the row. I'm going to do 2 single crochets into that stitch. Okay, and now I'm going to continue to add 2 single crochets in every second stitch. Okay, so I've gotten to the end of my row, so I'm going to remove my stitch marker again. And then I'm going to do the first stitch of my row and mark my stitch again. And in this row, I'm going to increase every third stitch. So I've done the first stitch, and here's the second. And now I'm going to do the third, and I'm going to do 2 single crochets in the same stitch. And I'm going to continue to increase every third stitch until I get back to the end of my row. Once again, I've gotten to the end of my row, so I'm going to remove my stitch marker and do the first stitch of my row. And for this next row, I'm going to stop increasing, but you can continue to increase if you want your doll to be a little bit bigger than the one that I'm making. In the next row, you would increase every 4th stitch, and then in the next row, every 5th stitch, and so on and so on. And you can just continue to increase as long as you like to have whatever size doll that you want. So I'm going to continue, and I'm not going to increase anymore. I'm going to continue for 5 more rows, and then I'm going to add the eyes to my doll. Now I've gotten to the end of 5 more rows of single crochet without increasing. So I'm going to add the eyes to my doll. And depending on how big you made your doll, you may want to put a few more rows than 5 before adding your eyes. And I like to add mine slightly to the left of the beginning of the row, so that they'll be more or less on the middle here. And I like to use black brads for the eyes of my dolls, but if you like, you can use safety eyes or animal eyes or anything like that. That's up to you. Or you can crochet yourself a pair of amigurumi eyes and sew them on later. But I'm going to be using these black brads, and I'm just going to place them slightly to the left of the beginning of my row. And it doesn't really matter where the eyes of your doll go. Depending on what character you're making, they may go in different places. That looks a little bit high, so I'm going to put it down a little bit. Now that I've put the eyes of my doll where I want them to be, I'm just going to open up the brads on the back of the work. So now I'm going to continue, and I'm going to add 3 more rows of single crochet without increasing or decreasing. I'm going to do the first stitch of my row and mark my stitch. And you can do as many rows as you like to get your doll's face to the length that you want. So I'm going to do 3 more rows, but depending on how big you made your doll, you may want to do more or less. So I got to the end of 3 more rows, and I actually moved my doll's eyes down a row because they were a little bit too high up. But now that I've got that in the right spot, now I'm going to start to decrease the doll's head. So I'm going to do the first stitch of my row, and now in this row I'm going to decrease every 3rd stitch. I'm going to decrease every 3rd stitch because up here I increase to every 3rd stitch, but you should decrease by whatever number you use to increase at the top of the head. So I've done my first stitch, and here is my second. So now I'm going to decrease the 3rd. So I'm going to pull up a loop in the 3rd stitch, and then pull up a loop in the next, and then I'm going to crochet together. And I'm going to do that every 3rd stitch. Okay, and on the 3rd stitch, pull up a loop in the next, and crochet together. And I'm going to continue decreasing every 3rd stitch until I get back to my stitch marker. So I've gotten to the end of that row. I'm going to do another row of decreasing. So I'm going to do my first stitch. And in this row, I'm going to decrease every 2nd stitch. So I'm going to decrease the next stitch. Pull up a loop in the next, and crochet together. So I'm going to do that every 2nd stitch. So I've gotten to the end of my row, but before I continue, I'm going to stuff the head of my doll. So I have some fiber fill here, and I'm just going to use that to stuff the head. So I finished stuffing the head, and I'm going to continue for another row of decrease. Now, depending on how big you made your doll, you may not want to decrease this row. If you made a bigger doll, you may want your doll to have a little bit of a thicker neck. But I'm going to decrease 1 more row. And in this row, I'm going to decrease every stitch. So I'm going to decrease the first stitch. And replace my stitch marker. And then I'm going to decrease every other stitch of the row. Okay, so I've decreased every stitch of my row, and now I'm going to do the neck. I'm just going to do 1 row for my doll's neck, so that it's not very long. But if you want to, you can make your doll have a much longer neck and just do as many rows as you like to get the look that you want. But I'm just going to do 1 row of single crochet without decreasing. Okay, I've gotten to the end of my row of single crochet, and that little row is going to be my doll's neck. So now I'm going to start to increase again so that I can start to make the body. I'm going to increase every stitch of the row. And if you didn't decrease every stitch of the row for this row to make your neck smaller, then you don't have to increase every stitch of the row. You should increase every other stitch of the row instead. But since my neck is thinner, I'm going to increase every stitch. So I'm going to do my first stitch and mark it. And then I'm going to increase that stitch by single crocheting again in the same spot. And I'm going to single crochet twice in every single stitch of the row until I get back to my stitch marker. I've gotten to the end of my row of increasing every stitch, and now I'm going to increase every other stitch of the row. And now I'm going to increase the second stitch. So I'm going to increase every second stitch all the way around until I get back to my stitch marker. So I've gotten to the end of my row, and for this part of the doll, I'm going to stop increasing all the way around, and I'm just going to increase the front of the doll. So I'm going to remove my stitch marker from the beginning of the row, and then I'm going to decide where the back of my doll is going to be. I'm going to put 1 stitch marker here, and I'm going to take a second one, and I'm going to mark it on the other side. And I'm going to mark about 9 stitches of the row. So I'm going to leave 9 stitches in the back without increasing, and then I'm going to start to increase every row in the front 3 times. So I'm going to continue to single crochet until I get to this stitch marker here. Okay, I've gotten to that stitch marker, so I'm going to put it into this row. And now I'm going to increase the front of my doll here. I'm going to add 3 increases, so I'm going to put 1 increase on this side, 1 increase in the middle, and 1 increase on this side. So I'm just going to go ahead and increase the very next stitch. So back into that stitch, I'm going to single crochet again. So I have 2 single crochets in the same stitch. I'm going to go on for a few more stitches. And now I'm going to add another increase here in the middle. And 1 more in the same stitch. And now I have 2 increases in the front of my work. So I'm going to continue until I get to the stitch right before this other stitch marker. Okay, and here is that stitch. I'm just going to single crochet twice into that stitch. And now I have my 3 increases on the front. So I'm going to continue to increase the front 3 times and to not increase the back. So I'm just going to single crochet in all of my marked stitches. Okay, I've gotten to my second marked stitch. And now I'm going to increase the front again 3 times. So the very next stitch, I'm going to increase, and then I'm going to continue for a little bit until I get to around the middle. And right here, I'm going to add another increase. Now I'm going to continue until I get to the stitch before my other stitch marker, and I'm going to add my last increase of the front. Okay, so I have increased the stitch right before my other stitch marker. So now I'm going to single crochet all of my marked stitches without increasing.